I'm going to turn on the recording, and at that point, Ron, the microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you, Sherwin, and I want to thank everybody for joining tonight. I assume you can see me okay, correct?
We can, as well as the picture of your entire family.
Okay, then how do I change it?
Well, you have a different file that you want to get up, or do you want to go?
Squire was supposed to be.
All right, so now,
the editor, some peer review and stuff.
Is this okay?
Well, now you're off screen sharing.
So if you want to send a link at all,
Ladies,
I don't have another way to do it.
Please keep your microphones muted.
About the vaccine.
Do you have a specific file you want to bring up?
No, I'm just trying to think of another way to share without having the whole picture of the family.
Now you're on alone. You're on yourself.
This is okay?
You're on the screen alone.
No.
It is on my screen.
Right now, we don't. Right now, all we see is you.
Okay, you can only. Okay, then if this is satisfactory, we'll go ahead.
It is satisfactory. Feel free to continue.
Okay, good. Thank you. So again, thank you very much for joining tonight. And the main thing I'm going to discuss tonight is vaccine hesitation and its causes, what sort of misinformation contributes to it. I'll talk about vaccine safety and how to deal with hesitation and misinformation. I'm going to start by discussing this for vaccines in general, and then for COVID in particular. So in fact, my talk is divided into two halves. The first half, I'm going to discuss the entire field of hesitation and how to deal with it, which is applicable to all vaccines. Then we'll have a break at that point, and I'll take questions and answers on everything that is not related to COVID. Then the second half, I'll describe how hesitation applies to COVID, and then we'll take questions specifically around COVID, and I'll talk about other kinds of information, vaccine information relevant to COVID in which people might be interested. I would also say, since there may be a lot of questions, we may not be able to cover anything, you're welcome to get in touch with me after this at my email address, which is my name, ronald.ellis@gmail.com. ronald.ellis@gmail.com. Feel free to get in touch with me later. So I'll start by defining hesitation, which simply put is a delay in taking a vaccine of any kind. It can also include refusal, where someone doesn't just hesitate, they just outright refuse to take a particular vaccine. And historically, it's been the case in countries like ours, in the United States, Europe, somewhere between 5 and 15% of the population range between hesitation and refusal, depending on the particular vaccine. We obviously hope for COVID, in particular in Israel, that this number will be a lot lower, and it's been very heartening to see all the people turning out and getting vaccinated. Nevertheless, hesitators and refusers sometimes are not, particularly hesitators, are not always so vocal, and therefore, those of you on this video who are hesitating, or any of you who have family members or friends who are hesitating, this may be useful. And if we can make sure that people are able to make informed decisions and not hesitate, then this would be worthwhile. Now, the other aspect about hesitation is related to worry over vaccine side effects, or worry over issues you don't know or you don't like about vaccines. And again, it just creates this doubt as to not necessarily going ahead and taking the vaccine right away. Now, I want to put forward maybe the most important principle in dealing with a vaccine and in dealing with hesitation, and that's the issue of the benefit to risk ratio. I'm going to start by saying every vaccine that's ever been made has risks associated with its use. Every medical product, every drug, every medical intervention has risks. They all have benefits too. And we're always assessing in our mind this benefit to risk ratio in everything related to medical affairs. In fact, in life in general, we are. Let's take, for instance, the biggest source of morbidity and mortality in society, which is automobile accidents. We know the statistics, yet none of us, or practically none of us, hesitate to get into a car, because in our own mind, without actually thinking it out, we feel that the benefits are far outweighing the risks. So we go ahead and we get in our car. We assume the risk, like when we go into an airplane. Now, there's another thing that makes the risk issue a little bit different for vaccines, which is that vaccines are given to healthy people. So let's say someone, chas v'chalila, has a cancer and they're taking a cancer drug. The cancer drug may have a lot of significant side effects for practically everybody who takes it, but if someone has the disease and the cancer will extend their life or improve their quality of life, then they're willing to take all the side effects that go along with it. Now, vaccines are given to healthy people, and as a result, the tolerance for side effects is less than a drug for a serious disease. So that's the risk side. Now let's consider another aspect of the benefit side. If we consider that from the end of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century, the average human lifespan went from the high 40s, around 47 to 48 years, to the low 70s. That's an increase of about 23 years in the average lifespan in a little over 100 years, which is phenomenal. Almost all of it is accounted for by two things, each of which is added about 10 years to the average human lifespan. One was clean water, and the other one was vaccines. Every year, vaccines prevent in the range of up to 2 to 3 million deaths per year, particularly among children who would have died otherwise were vaccines not available. So the benefits are tremendous for vaccines in general. And as we'll get to later, also obviously significant for COVID in particular. And the risks, that's what we're going to talk about now, so that we can all make informed decisions and weigh those risks against what seems to be a very strong benefit. Now let's just find two aspects of side effects. One I will call tolerability and the other is safety. So tolerability are the immediate reactions to a vaccine. It'll pain at the injection site, it'll swelling in the arms, some pain, headache, the things that happen fairly close to vaccination, whereas safety may be the more serious side effects that may show up later and be more serious. The vaccine tolerability tends not to be a big issue in vaccine hesitation. There may be some people who are afraid of needles, and for them, that's a source of stress. But for the most part, it's really the issues of safety. And the other more serious side effects are things that people might be more concerned with. The issue of hesitation started probably mostly in the 60s and 70s into the 80s with some side effects of particular vaccines. I highlight in particular the pertussis or whooping cough vaccine that was given at that time, which since has changed, had a lot of significant side effects and rarely had very significant side effects with sequelae, follow-ups that could last for years or more. And that, as I said, that vaccine was improved, but it started to give some doubts about vaccine safety. Another major event happened in the late 1990s, and some of you may have heard of Andrew Wakefield, and he was the perpetrator of one of the great medical frauds of the 20th century, where he associated vaccination with measles, mumps, rubella with changes in the intestine, and particularly with autism. That work was essentially refuted. There were a dozen or more labs, leading labs in the world, that attempted to reproduce the work and all failed. One by one, all the co-authors dropped off the paper. It came out that his lab and group was funded to the tune of 550,000 pounds by a legal group that files lawsuits on behalf of victims of a vaccine and of side effects of vaccines, and who promote these lawsuits. So they were in effect funding a lab to find information that would help them file more lawsuits. Lancet, one of the most prestigious journals in the world, withdrew the paper, and he was disbarred from ever practicing again in the UK. But the damage was done. Vaccination rates of many vaccines dropped precipitously, particularly measles, mumps, rubella, pertussis-containing vaccines. There were many children who died from these diseases because they were not vaccinated, and many suffered hospitalizations, serious side effects, and long-term effects because of this fraud, and it added fuel to the fire of vaccine hesitation. One of the other major contributors to vaccine hesitation has been the flourishing of the internet and the ability of the internet to spread large amounts of information very rapidly to everybody in the world. Some of the information is accurate, some is inaccurate, and a lot of vaccine misinformation was spread, which affected the reputation of vaccines. So now let's get into some of the particular causes and what we can do about them. Now, one is a new vaccine that may come out where it hasn't been around for a while and people are nervous about long-term safety. So they want to see the vaccine around for a long period of time before they're comfortable taking the vaccine. And that's true in general, not just for COVID. And I think in cases like this, it's important to consider the benefit to risk ratio. If a new vaccine is coming out for a disease that is immediately serious and can benefit the adult or the child for whom it's intended, then the benefit to risk ratio is very favorable. And we accept the fact there could be, at a very low incidence, some side effects, but this might be preventing diseases that cause severe impairment, lifelong side effects, or even mortality. So again, the benefit to risk ratio helps to put that into focus. Another issue gets into some of the non-scientific related issues, which is distrust of governments who like to put mandates on people and like to control populations. And there are a lot of people who feel that vaccines and the mandate to take vaccines is a way that the government is controlling their behavior. And it's taking away their freedom of choice to make their own medical decision. Well, again, it's important to look at the benefit to risk ratio and simply look at what's in the vial. What's in the vial doesn't know about the politics. What's in the vial knows what it can do to protect a person. And again, to consider the benefit to risk ratio of that. Now, the other issue of individual freedom in society is a more complicated one. And there are a lot of libertarians and areas in the United States in particular where people just want control over everything they can do medically. But they can't walk away from the fact that we're all members of the same society. We're all exposed to the same diseases. And if some of us are not protected for a disease, we can spread it to others, even if we're not taking the vaccine, or our children are not taking the vaccine. We saw that with measles outbreaks, particularly in the last few years. There was a famous outbreaks, unfortunately, in Disneyland and the New York area. And because there were groups not vaccinating, there were outbreaks and spread of disease to others in places that didn't have the disease at all. So protecting others is indeed very important. And I want to highlight one thing that was very dramatic for me. I was on business in Japan about 5 years ago. And I was in the hotels in Tokyo, and in a suburb of Tokyo where the meetings were. And I went back and forth by train. I noticed about 5 to 10% of the people on the train were wearing surgical masks, just like we're wearing in COVID. And I asked people about that in the company, and I said, you have a lot of people that seem to be afraid of getting a disease, and it doesn't seem like there's much disease. It's not flu season right now. And they said, I had it backwards. In reality, the people who were wearing masks had some infection. They did not want to spread the infection to other people. So they were wearing the masks to be altruistic. And that was indeed an eye-opener. And that's something we need to keep in mind also with regard to the fact that we're all members of the same society and we have a protection to protect other people, not just ourselves. Another cause I mentioned in terms of tolerability, the issue of being afraid of taking a needle. It happens I can only offer the comfort to those of you who are. It happens very quickly. Take a book with you and read it, or look at your phone and email while you're being injected. It'll go away very quickly. And again, keep in mind the benefit to risk is overwhelmingly in favor for just this short-term effect of a needle. It shouldn't really distract you. Now, a major issue now to deal with is the whole issue of vaccine misinformation. And a lot of the misinformation preys on people's fears. You can get people fearful of certain statistics, and they read it and they're afraid to take a vaccine. They can read about side effects. They can read about mortality from vaccines. They can read about all these things. The very important thing is to really check out the information and make sure that you understand the information and be careful about it. I'm going to draw an analogy, lahavdil, to misinformation about Israel in particular, and a lot of the anti-Israel articles and press you'll read where there's misinformation up to outright lies. And unless you research it yourself, you can believe it. So when you read something about vaccines that seems negative, before you draw a firm conclusion, look it up for yourself. Go online and discover the information. Talk to your physician, talk to another expert. Don't simply believe it any more than you're going to believe any slander you read about Israel. It's very important that you understand all the information for yourself. And I'll give you an example. This is actually, it's actually very applicable to COVID, which is the fact that you read in a COVID clinical trial. I read a headline saying that in the Pfizer trial, there were 2 people who took the Pfizer vaccine who died during the trial. And that's all it said. Now you read something like that, you'd come to the conclusion that it's a side effect of this vaccine that you could die. It's terrible. Why do you recommend the vaccine? What the article didn't say was the rest of the story. The rest of the story was that in the placebo group that got no vaccine, 4 people died. This is now an older population, which unfortunately people passed away. Mortality was actually higher, not really higher, but it was in both groups. So if you just hear that it's 2 in the vaccine group, you can't conclude anything realistic. You have to get the entire story. So I urge all of you, when you see what looks like information that is negative about vaccines, perhaps it's true, but dig for yourself and understand it. Don't hesitate to take the vaccine because of something you read on internet. Investigate it for yourself. Very, very important. Now I want to go into another aspect of vaccines, and before we go to a break and I take your questions, I want to get into the issue of safety and safety analysis of vaccines. So to understand safety of vaccine, it's very important to understand the safety compared to a placebo group. And I mentioned this previous article about vaccine, 2 people dying during trials, but when you see the placebo group, the concern goes away. Likewise, when you look at all the side effects of vaccines, you have to judge it in a clinical trial against the placebo. And in fact, to that effect, the safety data are kept in a very objective way. All large vaccine trials have what's called an independent safety monitoring group. And they look at all the safety during the course of the trial, and they make sure that the safety is still acceptable. And they perform comparisons of the vaccine to the control group, and that gives a lot of assurance. Another system that's very good for monitoring safety is the Vaccine Adverse Experience Group in the United States, known as VAERS. They collect all reports of vaccine-related effects, and they collect literally hundreds of thousands or millions of reports from anybody who takes any vaccine. And in fact, their reporting system led to withdrawal of a couple of vaccines where very rare side effects were found. And the other issue about safety is how safe is safe? Do we accept 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 as a tolerable level? We have to keep in mind, if you're worried about something as rare as 1 in 100,000, you're going to need 1 million or more subjects to be able to reliably see 1 side effect in 100,000. So some side effects may be extremely rare. They may come up later once vaccines have been around for a few years. But again, consider the benefit to risk ratio and realize from that that you can really see the benefit right away, and the side effects are very, at least as far as we know, maybe very rare. So I'm going to stop at this point and take a few minutes of your questions. And then we'll go on from there to talking about COVID vaccine in particular.
Okay, so Ron, there is a question on the chat box. Somebody said last night she had dinner with a friend in Paris, a healthy woman in her 40s, who doesn't want to take the vaccine because it affects one's DNA. She also wants to wait until it's been out for a while to see what the long-term side effects may be. What would you say to her?
If it's okay, that's a COVID question. I'd like to revisit that. Please come back with the same question under COVID. What I'll do now is, if we can, just take all questions on hesitation, information, safety, not specifically related to COVID, because it's really the necessary background for understanding COVID hesitation. We need to understand hesitation as a broad field.
Okay, if you have a question and want to ask it, feel free to unmute your mic, but please remute it after you ask the question.
In general, relating also to COVID, now they're talking about different strains. There's a new one they said that came out in South Africa recently, and they said that they think it's going to be very resistant to the vaccine. So in general, and when you get the flu shots, it's always a different strain that comes out after, and they say it's not going to be so effective. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, talking about flu vaccine, I mean, the flu virus changes year by year. It goes through major changes in its composition because of the nature of flu, which changes, and it's a much more changeable virus than most any other virus. So in fact, you have to get a totally different virus to grow. Whereas with COVID, the changes are restricted to a very small domain on the coronavirus. But with flu, that's what happens every year. And the vaccine is continually updated. There are actually 4 different flu strains that are used in every flu vaccine every year. And those change according to what is expected to be the dominant strain during that particular year. And it generally works. I mean, there's some years where the match is very good, some years where the match is not so good. But that's how change is dealt with. And with corona vaccine, it's possible in the future that there'll be changes. I'll get to that later. Can get to that later in a little more detail when we discuss coronaviruses in particular.
So Ron,
can I ask a question?
Hang on, there's another question in the chat. Said vaccines have been tied to the great increase in autoimmune disease such as ALS and perhaps with organs in mice. Is there such evidence? And the vaccine was approved very quickly by all governments, normally takes years with trials. Why should we trust the hurried vaccine?
Again, I want to hold off on the issue of hurried vaccine because that's really a COVID-related question. So please come back later when we discuss COVID.
Okay,
causing ALS or anything else, there is no reliable scientific data of which I'm aware where that's the case. There are many things you can ascribe. You know, people talk about increases in allergy also, and maybe that is associated with something, and people talk about how we have a much more sanitary environment, and that might contribute to increases in allergy. When studies have been done, and this is the kind of study you need to do, you look at millions of individuals who have received a vaccine, and you take a matched group of millions who have not, and you look for differences in disease incidence comparing one group and the other. When those have been done, to my knowledge about vaccines in general, there's no particular new disease that has been found associated with vaccination in general. So that's really not a risk. I'd mention as one example, there's a preservative that is included in certain vaccines, which is benign, but has a negative reputation. And some countries have removed that preservative. And one large study was done because people said this preservative, someone said this preservative is associated with autism. So you give the preservative, you get more autism. And in Denmark, I think around 15, 20 years ago, they did a study comparing a very large number of kids. Some got the vaccine with the preservative, some without. The higher incidence of autism were in the ones without the preservative. It actually was the opposite of what was expected. And I'm not saying that the preservative prevents autism, no one would say that, but it just goes to show that you need to look at very large groups, hundreds of thousands or millions, in order to draw conclusions about safety and about vaccines in general. That link has not been made, to my knowledge, with any other serious disease of that type.
Okay, there was another question. Somebody wanted to ask another question. I cut you off.
Yeah, I do.
Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, Ron.
Hi, Marilyn.
I have a question. I am still in the States because I can't get to Israel right now. And people are very hesitant to take the vaccine because they say that even though it gives you antibodies, how do they know how long the antibodies will last? Will they have to get another vaccine? And that's a lot of hesitation.
Yeah, I agree. It may be boosters, and I'm going to come back to that point under COVID when we talk about COVID in particular. But that's all right. I'm going to say in general, there are some vaccines which need frequent boosting, like flu vaccine. I hope most of us who are on this call take flu vaccine every year. Flu vaccine can take the lives of up to 1,000 Israeli citizens every year. It's not really talked about much in terms of statistics. The United States, somewhere between 20 and 60,000 people die a year of flu. So that's a serious disease. And those of us who, hopefully most of us are convinced of that, we take an annual flu vaccine so we can keep up our protection against flu. And for a disease like corona or other diseases in the future, whatever they may be, if they're serious enough and require annual boosters, well, that's what it takes to be safe, then that's what we should do. To me, an extra jab a year is a small price to pay if it's going to result in preventing a very serious disease, whether it's flu, corona, or something else.
Okay, Ron, two people have asked to explain the difference between live and dead vaccines.
A live vaccine is a vaccine that will replicate, I'm going to say in particular, a viral vaccine. So measles, mumps, rubella vaccines are live, meaning they will replicate in the child. They have been they've been passed in cell culture. They go through cells through numerous passage in laboratories. And as a result, it removes entirely their disease-causing capability. Because if you look at these vaccines, They do not cause, and they've been used in, I'll say, probably 1 billion kids by now. They don't cause the natural disease. They're remarkable in that regard, but they do replicate enough, and by duplicating, they cause protection just like the natural disease. A killed vaccine is one that does not replicate, which includes some corona vaccines, it includes all flu vaccines, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, hepatitis, pneumonia, all those vaccines are killed vaccines. So that's the difference. They both work in different ways, and some are better for some diseases than others. Some are technically feasible more for one disease than the other, and scientists use the best design that gives the best possible protection, again, depending on the disease and depending on whether it's technically capable in the laboratory to make one or the other kind of vaccine.
Great. Okay.
So maybe we should move on. I'm conscious, we have about 25 minutes. I want to leave time for Q&A and obviously time for Addler at the end.
I have one more question. How come in Montreal now we're hardly seeing any flu, like almost zero flu?
I'll give you a hypothesis of why that's the case without knowing for sure, because there's not much in Israel. The same behaviors that you use for corona work for flu and the common cold. If everybody is wearing a mask and social distancing, it's very difficult to transmit flu from one person to another. The common cold also, I know very few people who get colds these days, in addition to flu. So
then should this still be a year to take the flu shot, even if there's like almost zero flu?
Absolutely, it's a very safe vaccine, and if you happen to be one of the unlucky ones who's exposed, it's a very severe disease. And because it's such a safe vaccine, I would recommend taking it like other vaccines.
Right. Ron, I think we should move on.
Okay, fine. So I'm going to go on now to discuss about corona and some of the issues involved in coronavirus hesitation, then take your questions, and I'll talk a little about corona vaccine in general. First, I want to emphasize the fact that a corona vaccine was developed in less than 1 year, to me as a vaccine person, is absolutely mind-boggling. I don't know how many people anticipated would happen, but I thought it would take a few years. Others say a few years, 3 years, 5 years. You get all kinds of numbers. And it's amazing. I'm going to get into later some of the reasons for that, because some of the reasons for this rapid development are, in fact, some of the reasons that people are a little afraid, saying, gee, it happened so quickly. Why should I trust it? Now, let's get into the issue of tolerability and side effects. You know, if you compare the vaccine, COVID vaccine to placebo in the Moderna and the Pfizer trials, there are more kind of clinical complaints, sore arms, headaches, a slight fever, nothing really exceptional in that regard. The one major side effect that's come up, which is relatively rare, is allergy and near anaphylaxis. Now, those of you who go to reliable vaccine practices are always told, even if it's another vaccine, stay in the physician's office for 15 minutes. And the reason for that is allergic reactions do happen, particularly flu vaccine, most of which are prepared in hen's eggs. Those who have an egg allergy, there's some likelihood you will get an allergic reaction to flu vaccine. And there are other components of other vaccines that very rarely will give an allergic reaction. So you stay in the office. If you start getting a reaction, you can take phenylhexidine or another anti-allergy drug. And if it gets significant enough in the doctor's office, you get an EpiPen. I have 3 food allergies, and I've had 3 major allergic reactions over the years. And I take my EpiPen with me. And the vaccine was well tolerated, but those who've had the allergic reactions, you can cope with it. Now, it was also notable that the new vaccine is a design that's never been used before. And that leads to hesitation, of course. There's never been an RNA vaccine. Why should I take it now? We've never seen another vaccine that's been around long enough. So again, in the short run, what we can judge by is benefit to risk. There's no known long-term risk. And as I'll get into later, there's no reason to suppose there's a risk. There's no smoking gun, but the benefit is clear. You know the statistics on corona disease. I don't need to tell you. The benefit is extremely clear. And that's why so many authorities recommend it, because the benefit to risk ratio is overwhelmingly in favor, even though we don't know the long-term history. Now let's get into long-term history. You know, it's like a genetic vaccine, right? You know, you inject RNA and what happens, it gets into cells. Well, you know, RNA is a is not a permanent molecule. There's been a lot of research over the year on DNA vaccines, and one of the concerns has been the DNA persists. It can become part of the human genome and what happens. And it's a little bit more of an issue that people have thought about, whereas RNA, it's put into this lipid envelope and it's injected, and the lipid envelope enables it to fuse to cells and it gets taken up in cells. So the RNA gets deposited in cells. And there, the RNA is translated into protein. But RNA is a very short-lived molecule. Depending on the work you read, it's anywhere from many minutes to a few hours to up to a day, might be the half-life of RNA, and then it's turned over within cells. That's the nature of RNA. And then that means that there's a limit to the amount of COVID protein it'll make in cells. Now, the cells will present it on the surface, and you may argue that protein will persist, but that's also not the case. Cells are continually refashioning and resynthesizing their surface, including the proteins on the surface, and the proteins will turn over as well in a matter of days or weeks and go away. But it's no different from other vaccines, right? You know, measles, mumps, rubella, and other vaccines, they replicate, they persist for a while. When you're injected with hepatitis or other vaccine, the vaccine stays, it's actually deposited in your arm, and the antigen stays in your arm for a number of weeks and provides an immune stimulation like corona does on the surface of cells. So again, not a risk of the same kind, because RNA just doesn't persist and the protein made from the RNA doesn't persist. So that gives an extra measure of safety of not to be concerned. Now, the whole issue again of safety and efficacy of, do you bring out the vaccine soon? Do you wait for more safety data? Well, if there weren't a raging pandemic right now, if the pandemic had gone away, maybe the vaccine would not be widely used, but it's alive and well. We know that in all countries. So the benefit to risk ratio is much different now than if there were no pandemic. And that's why it's worth the small amounts of perhaps long-term risk that's not known compared to the immediate benefit of saving serious disease and saving lives. Okay, was it developed too quickly? How on earth did it happen in 1 year? And I'll say this, the average vaccine, the average takes about 10 to 12 years. I spent early in my career a fair amount of time working on chickenpox vaccine. From the first dose into man until commercial approval was 25 years. It's mind-boggling, 25, and this is done in less than 1 year. So why 1 year, and why do we trust it? Well, first of all, coronaviruses are well known. The human coronavirus we're dealing with now is coronavirus number 7 that's known to man. 4 of these are causes of the common cold. It's the second most common cause of the common cold next to rhinovirus, which is the most common cause. And there are 2 other severe coronaviruses that have come along. One is known as SARS, number 1, and the other is MERS, which is a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. Both of these viruses caused high rates of death, high rates, very high rates. Somewhere between 10 and 40% of infected people died from the disease, but their transmissibility from person to person was extremely low. But some vaccine development work was done on those, and that gave us a lot of lessons learned for our coronavirus number 2, our current coronavirus. In particular, we know about the receptor on cells for coronavirus. We knew which part of coronavirus to target for a vaccine, namely the so-called S or spike protein. If you see these pictures of the virus under a microscope, you see these lovely spikes. They look like crowns, and that's why corona, the Latin word for crown. It's a lovely looking virus. The tips of those crowns are where the spike protein is located. That's where the virus binds to cells, and that's where the antibody that will neutralize or kill the virus binds to those spikes also. So we knew all of that when the sequence came out, and we knew that the current pandemic was caused by a coronavirus. There are also animal models that were already available for other coronaviruses, and some of these could be adapted for the current coronavirus. We knew about neutralizing antibody and how to make antibody assays in the laboratory to rapidly test people who've been exposed to virus or vaccine and show they're making the right kind of immune response to stop the infection. So it was relatively easy to create these assays right away. So all these technical things were in place that enabled an incredible jumpstart, particularly for the RNA vaccines and vector vaccines that could just be plugged into these cassettes and then be able to make a vaccine right away. But there were other parts as well. If you look at what it takes for a company to develop a vaccine, it takes hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, and companies are very careful about advancing through development. Be very careful all steps along the way that you know that the vaccine is really working. Each step, evaluate very carefully in committees, go to regulatory agencies, and step by step, it can take a year for phase 1, 2 to 3 years for phase 2, several years for phase 3, each one being carefully justified. Is there a market for the vaccine? Will groups like Centers for Disease Control in different countries recommend it? Will it be reimbursed by authorities? And do advocacy to make sure these things exist and not bring out a vaccine that no one will take. And what's the market for the vaccine? So all these things have to be done in companies. And that's why 10 to 12 years for a vaccine is nothing. Even highly successful vaccines like human papilloma vaccine, which prevents infections, that prevents cervical genital cancer and nasopharyngeal cancer, it still took 12 years, even though that was a huge medical need, because you have to go through all these different steps. But all these steps went away with Corona. There was a bottomless well of money. The United States put billions into it. Gates, donor organizations put in huge amounts of money, and companies put in their own resources, recognizing it's a mandate and they would be used. They didn't need to convince anyone to take a vaccine. They knew it would be reimbursed. They knew people would take it. They knew groups would recommend it. So all the things, the non-scientific things, the money, the justification, the committees, the debates with regulatory agencies and clinicians, advocacy groups, marketing groups, all of that was non-existent for Corona because of the pandemic mandate. Coupled with all the technical issues, that's why it happened faster than anyone thought it could happen. It's perhaps a one-in-a-lifetime event. I don't know that it'll happen with another vaccine. God forbid there won't be another pandemic by another virus and we go through this again. But that's what it did. So if you hear about all those issues, be less fearful about why it took only a year. Tremendous technical background, and all the non-technical things fell in place right away. So those are the issues I think that should hopefully temper the issue of risk of vaccine and fear of it happening too quickly, fear of what may happen in the long term. There's no smoking gun yet. There may be something at a very rare effect like every vaccine, but we haven't seen that yet. And the benefit is clearly overwhelming. So we have this overwhelming benefit to risk ratio. I want to get into, in a couple of remaining minutes, just some related issues, not exactly on hesitation, but I've been asked questions about this. I just want to throw out some of this information regarding to how the vaccines work. First of all, the vaccines I won't say never, but I'll say never. We're never going to eliminate this virus. It's going to be like flu in all likelihood. It'll be around, hopefully at very low levels, like rhinovirus, adeno, all these respiratory viruses. They have a way to persist. This one will too. But hopefully we keep it at a very, very low level. We will not be able to achieve sterilizing immunity. There's some vaccines that are so effective that the virus gets into the host and the virus can't even replicate, like hepatitis B virus as an example. This virus, we will not achieve sterilizing immunity, which means if you take a vaccine and you encounter the virus, you'll be protected, hopefully, at a very high rate, 95%. But you'll still be replicating virus, which means you're still able to transmit it to other people, which again says something about the need to at least have a mask until there are very low levels of virus. And we'll wait to see how health authorities recommend the use of masks after vaccination. I'm assuming they'll recommend it until virus is at low level because of, first, you might be among the 5% who are vulnerable. The virus is not vaccine is not 100% effective, and the altruistic reason of not transmitting an infection, which you still might get, transmitting it to other people. The duration of protection is currently not known. Probably good for at least a half a year, perhaps closer to a year. Good likelihood of boosters, and stay tuned for further developments. Pfizer and Moderna undoubtedly are following vaccine groups that were vaccinated, follow their antibodies for a year, see how they go down, and then authorities will recommend booster policy based on when the antibody levels are getting low enough that there's concern about whether you can still maintain clinical protection or not. So I think that's something that'll come from health authorities, and the data for that will come faster than you get vaccinated. because the cohorts that were vaccinated by Pfizer and Moderna, they were vaccinated starting in the summer. They're running 6 months ahead of the vaccine cohort now in the public hands. So they'll find out about need for booster before any of us have to worry about the booster. So for now, you can rest assured you have a high rate of protection from these vaccines, and that's fantastic. Now, other things, 3 vaccines on the market. Can you take one vaccine, boost it a year later with another vaccine? That data will also come out of companies. They're going to compare it to each other, and others will compare it to make sure you can take one vaccine and be boosted by another vaccine. What level of herd immunity is needed remains to be speculated. Maybe it's 80%, maybe more. That remains to be seen. But don't rely on that for protection. Take the vaccine. Protect yourself. Don't assume that you're going to hesitate. You'll be protected because others are protected. Don't do it. It's your life at stake. Nothing should come as a higher principle than that. With that, I'm going to close what I'm presenting, and we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then after that, Adler has a few words.
There are many chats, Ron. Take a look at your chats. Questions.
Yeah.
Open your chat.
I am. Okay, until Wednesday, let's see, go to the top.
Read the question and read the question.
No, some of them are already, we've already discussed. We talked about long-term effects. We talked about long-term effects of RNA technology. Autoimmune disease we talked about. If someone has antibodies to COVID already, should they take the vaccine? At this point, yes, you've probably recognized, you've heard about people who have had the disease and then can get reinfected. We don't know the levels of antibodies after natural disease, and at some point it's prudent to take. I think health authorities will formulate a better policy, but if there's any doubt, vaccination is the right thing. And there is no evidence that putting a vaccine on top of disease for pretty much any vaccine can cause a problem. We talked about live and dead vaccines. The ingredients of the vaccine vary, and the main of the current vaccines, it's RNA in a lipoprotein coat with other minor chemical constituents, which enable it to form this envelope that will fuse with the cell. Not taking ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is not taught to be a risk factor, and there hasn't been any more press on that beyond initial reports. Now, the effect on the next generation of women and pregnant women should take it. On the one hand, there's no reason to suspect it should be a risk for pregnant women. On the other hand, it has not been tested in pregnant women. So to my understanding, a pregnant woman should not take the vaccine. Once the vaccine has been tested in pregnant women to make sure it's safe, then it can be taken. And there are also testings that are done in animal models of pregnancy and birth to make sure there are no effects, and the manufacturers do those tests as well. So for now, I think the policy is that pregnant women should not take it until the companies say they have safety data that allows it to be taken. Again, there's no concern, but pregnant women are in a separate category for essentially every vaccine and drug. And it's very important because of the history of testing in pregnant women that they be tested separately, and then policy follow from that. We talk about live and dead vaccines. Why do some vaccines require one shot and more than one? Depends on the nature of the vaccine. Most vaccines, in fact, require more than one shot. The COVID vaccines so far require more than one. Measles, mumps, rubella, which was thought to be a one-dose vaccine. There's a booster vaccine that's given to kids around age 4 to 6. Polio, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, hepatitis are all multi-dose. There are, in fact, very, very few one-dose vaccines. Now, Shingrix is a little different. Shingrix is actually a therapeutic vaccine because chickenpox virus goes into your neurons and stays latent in your neurons for most of your life. And in latent life, when your immune system weakens, it pops out and causes shingles. So one dose is enough to boost the immune system because the immune system is basically primed to varicella. You give it a boost with Shingrix and it keeps the virus suppressed in neurons and doesn't pop out and cause shingles. That's the reason that that one is an exception. See, pregnant women, we talked about reproductive risks, we mentioned. Again, young children, it hasn't been tested yet in young children. No reason to think there is a risk, but it hasn't been tested. And the prudent thing with all vaccines and drugs is until it's tested in particular risk groups, it's better to not go into those risk groups. Children will undoubtedly be tested soon. Now, 21 days for Pfizer, do a few days matter? No, they don't. In reality, probably anywhere from about, I'll say 17 days out to 28 days for either RNA vaccine. Moderna is a 28-day interval. It just so happened Moderna tested 28, Pfizer tested 21. They didn't evaluate the intervals. It's just based on general vaccine science that an interval like that for the first 2 doses is a good interval. So if there's a delay out a week beyond 21 days with Pfizer, it's really no matter, and Moderna is 28 days. The vaccine does not inject a microchip. Do people have vaccine fluoresce? No, they don't. Hopefully they should not have any unusual side effect of that kind at all. There's nothing in the vaccine that would cause that. Is there a danger that the vaccine could make antibodies against human muscle and cause autoimmune disease? That hasn't been seen with other vaccines, and there's no reason to suppose that because the virus protein is recognized as foreign by itself. It doesn't drag in an immune response against other proteins. And in fact, there have been preclinical tests in animal species looking for that, and no one's found that kind of autoimmune effect. Pregnancy, we talked about. Is there a danger with less research vaccine? I just talked about why fast is not really a problem because of all the unusual issues that came together for this wonderful vaccine. Let's see, is it effective against new variants? We talked about variants. All variants will have to be tested. The variant, the vaccine appears to be effective. The South Africa vaccine, there is some indication or some initial report that it might be less effective, not ineffective, but less effective, that you might need higher levels of antibody for that variant. Now, the one comforting thing with many of the variants is the same sequence that binds antibodies for neutralization is the same sequence that binds to cells. And it's probably the case that if a virus mutates enough to get away from the vaccine, it probably will not bind well to the cell receptor and be much less infectious. And that's at least some comfort with vaccines. But reality is variants will have to be tested. And if a variant becomes dominant enough and works less well, the vaccine, we'll be in a situation like flu, where manufacturers may vary the vaccine or have a mixture of 2 different variants in the vaccine. I think time remains to be seen on that. In terms of nanotechnology, well, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are nanoparticles. They're very small. So in a sense, it is nanotechnology, but it's made of components that are similar to those in cells and can be readily taken up by cells. And that's their mechanism of action. Vitamin D may strengthen the immune system, and strengthening your immune system is always a good idea. It may help you combat an infection better. You might even respond to vaccines better. There's some data in the literature that vitamin D enhances responses for some vaccines. Is there a thing as memory? Yes, in fact, there is. And if you give initial doses of the vaccine, you can expect that you will have immune memory. Your immune cells that circulate in your blood will remember the COVID virus. And when you come back a year later with a boost, your levels of antibodies will shoot way up. In fact, hopefully even to levels higher than after the initial vaccination. Because it's been shown with other vaccines, you give it at 0 and 1 month, you get a certain response like human papilloma vaccine. The booster at 6 months, you go sky high. So we may expect that the booster at a year, if it works really well, then subsequent boosters might need to be given less frequently. Again, I don't want to jump to that conclusion because that's only an argument. Only data will tell the case. But there's reason to think that the booster response will be good and help us after taking another dose, whether it's after 6 months, a year, or longer. Okay, we talked about second dose, 24 days is okay. The RNA vaccine that's being developed is a vectored vaccine. It's actually the vaccine antigen. The S is carried by a virus. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine and Merck vaccines are also the vaccine, corona spike protein, are being carried by viruses. The virus enters the cell makes RNA, and it displays the protein on the surface, just like the Moderna and Pfizer. The Sanofi GSK vaccine, on the other hand, is a killed inactivated vaccine. We talked about dinner. Will it affect DNA? There's no basis for thinking it'll affect DNA. The RNA in the vaccine is short-lived in cells. We covered that, lasts anywhere from minutes to hours, and then the RNA is turned over. The vaccines are tested very extensively in animals. Women trying to get pregnant The answer probably is to hold off on it, but it's better to consult with your physician on that one, just to be certain as to where you are. We talked about safety in pregnancy. The IBI vaccine, we talked about shingles. Vaccine is multi-dose. One vaccine is multi-dose, the other one is not. The Merck vaccine is 1 dose, the GSK vaccine is 2 doses. So depending which vaccine you get, one is 1 dose, one is multi-dose. We've talked about vectored vaccines, nanotechnology we talked about, nursing baby transmit antibodies to the mother. Well, actually the mother could transmit antibodies to the child. If the mother has anti-corona antibodies, they will transmit across the placenta to the child. Is it safe to travel after taking the second? Yeah, I think it is, and I think Israel is getting together a program, which other countries might as well, the green passport, that'll make it easier to travel. You should assume you'll be protected, and the time of protection is at least 5 days after dose 2 for Pfizer, similarly, or a week after Moderna. And then you'll be protected, and the length of protection will depend on, as I discussed earlier, the duration of immunity studies that are being done by the manufacturer. Now that's all the questions, and it's also now leaves 5 minutes. I'm going to close here and turn it over to Rav Adler and thank everyone for their attention. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to send me email. I'm more than happy to discuss anything here or otherwise with you. So, Rav Adler.
Thank you, Ron. Rav Adler, the microphone is yours.
Good evening. First of all, thank you very, very much, Ron, and how fortunate we are to have such an outstanding individual in our neighborhood. And with the Zoom technology, so his Torah is able to spread Mitzion, not only here in Yerushalayim, but to the entire world. So in my name and name of the entire Kehillah, we thank you very, very much for this very, very, very exquisite presentation. I'm a little bit concerned that I recall when the great Chazan Moshe Kosovitsky gave a concert, and then the Rabbi Shor got up to say a little Dvar Torah, some of the people walked out because people have an allergic reaction to the rabbi's talk. And therefore, if anybody's feeling a little bit edgy, so take an antihistamine pill and just stick around for a few minutes. And I think we have something to contribute. One of the issues here has to do with, number one, it's a Torani issue. Everything in Judaism has the Torah has something to say. And no doubt when it comes to health issues, the Torah has a lot to say. And that is because the Torah gives us the imperative to live, v'chai b'hem. And anything that allows a person to continue to live is part of the message of Torah. God wants us to continue living and being as healthy as possible. The Rambam spent much time developing the idea of preventive medicine. There is a journal out there called Rambam Maimonides, a medical journal. And one quote is, he preached preventive medicine. There was a great individual who I had the honor of meeting more often than not, Dr. Fred Rosner, and he wrote a whole book on Moses Maimonides and preventive medicine. And there's so much has been written about the Rambam's opinion about preventive medicine. No doubt it has its roots in Greek philosophy, Aristotle, but the Rambam gave it a very, very Torah angle and approach. The two key psukim are found in Dvarim in Parshat Ve'etchanan, V'nishmartem me'od lenafshotechem, and I stress the word me'od, be careful about your lives, and the pasuk, Rak yishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha me'od. In both cases, the Torah uses the word very, very careful. And the Rambam uses this imperative in a variety of halachot that has to do with damage prevention and health prevention. And he will cite these psukim all over the place. And therefore, many times, people, they feel they've consulted scientists, they've heard talks, the likes of which we heard now from Ron and other people, specialists in the field. But there's always a single voice that pops up who has credentials, academic credentials, and raises questions about this. But we look at the world at large, we look at the overwhelming sentiment of the world of science that is in favor of this particular vaccination. That in itself obligates us to take into consideration that majority, overwhelming majority point of view, and not to single out a particular minority view, because you're always going to have somebody who's going to say it ain't necessarily so. And we cannot follow that opinion. Our Chachamim say, Yesh Chochma Bogoyim, by the nations of the world, there is wisdom, and certainly scientific wisdom and technological abilities, and they've done wonders, nothing less than miraculous, the way Ron described the procedure, and he tried to give an understanding of why we got it done within a year, but this is really a miracle of sorts. And having said that, the fact that those Rabbanim who've gone public on the question of the vaccination, I have not heard one serious rabbinic authority who urged his constituents or followers not to take the vaccine. That doesn't mean you don't have some Rabbanim who are hedging and hawing, but they kept the lid on it and they did not go public. Those who went public include those from the yeshiva world of Bnei Brak, like Rav Kanevsky, and from the Rosh Yeshiva from Ponevezh. They include the Gerer Rebbe from the Hasidic side. They include the leading Sfardi Rabbanim here in Eretz Yisrael. They include great poskim like Rav Osher Weiss from Ramot Gimel. They include great Rosh Yeshiva and poskim in the United States like my own teacher, Rav Hershel Shechter and Rabbi Mordechai Willig. They are very emphatic about the idea, not just encouraging, emphatic that we have to do it, and we have to do it for halachic reasons. And having said that, it becomes our obligation to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for what he has allowed mankind to come up with in such a short amount of time. The same Rambam makes a comment in his Mishnah commentary to the end of the 4th chapter of Psachim. So those who are learning Daf Yomi, you're going to get to this in the end of Perek Dalid, the 4th chapter of Psachim, where the Gemara talks about 6 items that our King Chizkiah HaMelech introduced. 3 of them our Chachamim applauded, and 3 they did not applaud. One of the things that he did and Chachamim applauded was he took a digest of medical information and hid it, ganaz, put it out the pasture. And the whole question is, why did he do that? And the Rambam tells us that there's no question that that medical digest was not a practical book, was a theoretical book, and people were misusing it, and hence Chizkiah did the right thing. But then on the subject itself, the Rambam says that just as food is there to alleviate the pain of hunger, so medication is there to alleviate the pain of physical suffering. And he says, just as the Torah requires us to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ve'achalta v'savata u'verachta Hashem Elokecha, for the food, we are obligated to say thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the ability that mankind has of coming up with preventive medicine in the form of a vaccination. I can tell you that questions came up to Rav Osher Weiss and to my Rebbe Rav Shechter, whether or not when you get the vaccination, you should make a Shechianu bracha, because Shechianu is a bracha when you are overjoyed, you're with effervescent simcha, you're so thrilled that you want to say Shechianu v'kimanu v'gyanu l'zman hazeh. So Rav Shechter heard the question and he said, why Shechianu? You should say a different bracha, Hatov v'hamitiv. And the difference between the bracha of Shechianu and Tov v'hamitiv is Shechianu, if it's done for you and you only, and you're happy about it, that's a Shechianu. But if it was done, you benefit and others benefit, then it's Hatov v'hamitiv as well. It means you take into consideration others. In the case of COVID, we're not only worried about ourselves. We're worried about Kol Yisrael, Arayim Zeh B'zeh. We're all intertwined. We're all responsible mutually for each other, and not only within the world of Klal Yisrael. This is a world concern of mutual responsibility. And hence, there's certainly room for Hatov HaMeitiv. It's interesting that Rav Osher Weiss handled it slightly differently. And he said that, you know, if you remember back in Chutz La'aretz, when they did a Brit Milah, so they did not make a Shechianu. Here in Eretz Yisrael, we do make a Shechianu at a Brit. And one of the reasons given that we don't make a Shechianu at a Brit for those communities that have that custom is because the baby is in pain at the moment that the Brit is done. And therefore, Tsar Yanuka, the baby is in pain. It's difficult to say a Shechianu at that moment. So Rav Osher Weiss says The minute you get a shot in the arm, it hurts, and you might even feel a little bit some pain afterwards. Maybe we shouldn't make a shehecheyanu. But on the other hand, he says he recognized the fact that we should express our thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he comes up with this glorious answer: eat a new fruit or take a new garment and make a shehecheyanu on it, and have in mind the fruit. So yeah, okay, this is the shot. So this is a classic halachic response. And then he goes on to say, he has published so many svarim, by the way, in the world of halakha, and he is overjoyed every time a new sefer comes out, and he wants to make a shehecheyanu on the new book, but what he does is he buys a new pair of tzitzis, and he makes a shehecheyanu on the tzitzis. I'm just going to leave you with one anecdote in my family. When we moved from Beersheba to Yerushalayim in 1981, so my daughter Hannah, who today is a serious Talmud Chacham in her own right, was 6 years old, never saw a snowflake in her life in Beersheba. The first winter on the porch in our house in Ramot, it snowed heavily, and there was a nice accumulation on the porch. And my daughter comes out at age 6, and she wants to make a shehecheyanu, seeing the snow for the first time. So I said, all right, I have to look it up, whatever. On her own, she goes to the closet, gets a new sweater, puts it on her pajamas, runs out, and says a shehecheyanu on the sweater, and has kavanah, has intention also for the snow. I said, where did you get that idea from? She said, from the second night of Rosh Hashanah, where we put a fruit on the table so that we should be able to say the shehecheyanu. That's where Talmidei Chachamim come from at age 6. But Rav Osher Weiss uses the same thing. But nevertheless, we should be grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for this wonderful development in medicine, in the medical technology, that we're able to slowly but surely exit this pandemic. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bring a refuah shlema to all those who are sick, and alleviate the pain from all those who are suffering. And Am Yisrael and the world at large should know no more tsar from this particular epidemic. Erev Tov.
Rav Adler, thank you very much. Ron, again, thank you very much as well. We have recorded this session. For those of you that are not on our synagogue mailing list, if you want a copy of if you want the link to the recording, please send me an email. I put my email address on the chat, and we'll make sure you get that as well. Again, thank you to Ron, thank you to Rav Adler, and thanks to those of you who participated as well from abroad. We have quite a few people from the United States and at least one person from Paris that I see. So thank you again.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Very
Hannah.
informative.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Bye, Mary.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Okay. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks for joining.
All right.